Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are once again going to be taking a look in at the Global Chess League, which is being held in Dubai. And of course, today we are going to take a look at the game of the former world chess champion, Magnus Carlsen. Now, last time that we covered a game, Magnus was doing quite well. He was on a +1 score with 1 win and a couple of draws, and then he lost a very difficult game to Maxime Vachier-Lagrotte. However, after that loss, Magnus put together 2 marvelous wins against both Vishy Anand and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Now, spoiler alert, because after this game which we're covering here, I will take a brief look at the end game between Magnus and Anand from a couple of days ago, because so many of you guys left your comments and asked me to take a look at it. So without further ado, let's jump into the action. So this is the 8th round of the Global Chess League, and we have the game between Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces and Levon Aronian with the black pieces. Now, Magnus two wins in a row, trying to really turn up the heat, turn in a very fine performance, and he starts with 1b3. So Magnus chooses to play 1b3 on the first move against Levon, and he decides to say, I literally don't care. But then to follow the memes, he also says, to follow the memes, we go, bro thinks he's Hikaru. As everybody knows, Hikaru Nakamura is one of the pioneers of this opening with 1b3. There are even people on sites like Chessable who've made courses about Hikaru Nakamura's 1b3 repertoire. So it's an opening that Hikaru has pioneered. Now, of course, with all due respect to Hikaru, Magnus has actually played this quite a bit too. He won a very nice game in the World Blitz and Rapid against Eric Hansen, also known as the Chess Bra. So it's an opening that he has essayed quite a bit. So we get b3 on move number 1, and now Levon chooses to play the move d5. Magnus goes bishop b2, and here Levon plays knight to f6. Now, according to the standard theory, I do believe that bishop g4 is considered to be the most testing move, and it is the move that Eric himself played against Magnus. I believe that game continued with f3 here by Magnus and bishop f5. Now, of course, Magnus being Magnus, he was able to outplay Eric and win that game, but nonetheless, I do believe that 2 bishop g4 is considered to be the most testing move, because if white tries to play knight f3 after bishop takes knight, pawn takes knight, knight to f6, normally white tries to go for the double fianchetto with the bishop on g2 and b2, but after black plays g6 and bishop g7, generally it's a very solid structure, and it's hard for white to prove an advantage. And I myself have had this position a couple of times too with the white pieces. Just in general, it doesn't feel like it's a whole lot. At any rate, Levon decides to go for knight f6 instead. We get the move knight to f3, and now we have bishop g4 being played on move 3. Magnus chooses to play e3, and now Lev goes e6, trying to finish his development on the king side by moving the dark square bishop and castling the king out of the center of the board. So after e6, we get h3, bishop to h5, and now Magnus goes d3. Now, the idea behind d3 is very subtle here. What white would love to do is play the move g4, and after bishop g6, go knight to h4 and capture the bishop on g6. Bishop looks really nice here. It's eyeing this long diagonal. So if you can capture the bishop, trading the knight for this knight on h4, the bishop on g6, it should be quite good for white. But if you do it here, black can potentially play the move bishop to e4, and after f3, black can now place move bishop d6 with the idea of bishop g3, checking the king and winning the knight. And already here, black is a little bit better. So when Magnus goes d3, the idea behind this move is quite simple. If black plays, let's just say knight bd7, for example, now after g4, bishop g6, knight h4, there's no longer a square available for the bishop on either e4 or f5. And after, say, bishop d6, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop g2, white is generally a little bit better here with the double bishop pair. And additionally, white can play knight d2, queen e2, castles, and just, it's not the most pleasant position for black to play. So for that reason, Lev plays h6 here, anticipating g4, because now after g4, you go bishop g6, and you can slide the bishop back to h7 after either knight to e5, which is what was played in the game, or knight to h4. Either way, you keep this nice light square bishop on the board. Now, this is actually a very common theme with the structure from multiple openings here. When we look at this position, let's just say, actually, let me set it up in a different order. One of the most common openings that we've gone over is the London system, and one of the very common themes, especially when black tries to fianchetto his bishop here, is that at some point you want to make sure to be very careful that this knight h5 move is not available and that you have this h2 square, which is why normally white tries to play h3, so that all these ideas with knight h5 allow white to go bishop h2 and keep the bishop alive on this long diagonal. So back to the game here. This is a very common theme when you got a structure of 3 pawns with the bishop either on f5 or h5, that you have to be aware of these knight h4 tricks. So we get knight e5. Bishop to h7 played here by Levon, and now we get the move knight to d2. Here Levon plays knight fd7, trying to trade off the knights. I'm not really sure if there's any difference between knight fd7 or knight bd7. Honestly, it doesn't really look like it makes a huge difference to me, but Lev plays this knight instead of the other one. So we get knight takes knight, and now Magnus plays bishop g2. Now on first glance, position pretty balanced here. Bishop on h7 could be a slight liability for black. The pawns on c2 and d3 are guarded. Bishop doesn't really have a lot of scope. On the other hand, white has played h3 and g4, so if white tries to castle kingside, the pawn structure is a little bit compromised in front of the king. So after bishop g2, we get c6 from Levon, creating the classic pyramid of Giza here with the pawns from f7 to d5 and b7 to d5. Additionally, now with the pawn chain from b7 to d5, this bishop has very little scope either. For example, if black were to play knight b6 and somehow you go c4 and black takes, now the diagonal is completely open for the light square bishop. So after c6, any idea with c4 does nothing, and in fact it simply hangs a pawn on d3 here. So after c6, we get queen to e2, queen to c7, and now Magnus decides to play the move f4 here. Now once Magnus plays f4, it's pretty clear cut that Magnus is committed to castling queenside. He could still castle to the kingside. He keeps both options available, but when he plays his f4 move, it becomes pretty clear that he intends to castle long, because what f4 is trying to do in terms of Levon's approach is he's trying to tell Levon, look, you're not going to be able to castle kingside. If you ever move the bishop, you're going to hang this pawn. So if you can't move the bishop here, and I've played f4, I can go g5, h4, and it's really trying to prevent black from even thinking about castling to the king side. But at the same time, you also know that white is almost certainly going to the queen side as well, so therefore black shouldn't worry too much. So after f4, we get f6 here, and now Magnus decides to castle to the queen side. Levon plays queen to a5, attacking the pawn on a2, and now Magnus plays this move e4 here. Very interesting move. Of course, white could play king b1 first to guard the pawn, but Magnus correctly realizes that after e4, if black takes the pawn on a2 here, after pawn takes pawn, on first glance, it looks like after bishop a3, white might be in a lot of trouble here, but in fact, white can very calmly just trade the bishops. Because if you go queen to a1 check, it's not checkmate. I can block with the knight and guard my bishop, and now you lose, you resign, GG, why not? And after queen takes a3, king b1, white is simply winning here due to the open diagonals, the threats on this open e-file towards the king, and black really doesn't have anything satisfactory here. He's going to end up down at least a couple of pawns, if not more material. So Levon decides to castle queenside, and now we get king to b1 being played by Magnus, bishop to a3 played by Levon, trying to exchange these dark square bishops. Now this bishop on b2, which is fianchettoed here, it's pretty well placed. On the other hand, black's bishop doesn't really have great scope. If you go bishop d6, white can just play rook f1, maybe e5 next move as well, and so it makes sense to try to get rid of this dark square bishop for those two reasons. First of all, the bishop doesn't really have great scope from other squares, and secondarily, it's fianchettoed here, so if you can get rid of this dark square bishop, the white king can become very vulnerable without the dark square bishop in front of it. So after bishop to a3, we now get bishop takes a3 being played here, queen takes a3, and now we have e takes d5. Levon decides to capture with the e pawn, and now there's really only one open file that the players can contest, which is this e file here. So after e takes d5, we get rook he1, and Levon chooses to play this move f5 here, and now Magnus goes knight to f3. Now I don't know if I really like f5, but on the other hand, when you look at this position, it feels very difficult for black to play for a couple of reasons. White controls the e file here with the rook and the queen, so white controls the e file. Your bishop on h7 is in real danger of getting locked behind the pawn wall. Say you go king c7 f5, for example, your bishop is really sad with these pawns killing the scope, and if you go to g8, that doesn't really do a whole lot. I can even just play queen e7, and all of a sudden with the active rooks here, black is in a lot of trouble. So Lev plays f5, which is very committal because it does close down this diagonal, but what Levon is hoping for here is that he can get the knight to f6 and play rook h8 and contest the e file. Also, for everybody who's wondering, the reason rook h8 is not a very good move here is that after queen takes rook, rook takes king c7 here, after white plays f5 with the locked in bishop on h7, in this position, when you have the two rooks versus queen, generally two rooks are better than a queen, not always, but with the bad bishop as well, this is just horrible for black. So that's why rook h8 is not a good move, because in this case the two rooks are significantly better than the queen. So here we get the move f5, and now Magnus plays knight to f3. Levon trades the pawns, and now he goes rook h to f8. So at this point, Magnus plays f5 here, thematic move, just locking in the bishop behind the pawns, and now we get to move knight to f6. And here Magnus plays this crazy move bishop to h3. Now, I'm not sure what was going through Magnus's head when he played this move, but I suspect that he simply overlooked the next move that Levon played. Now, at this point, it's actually very hard to understand why white is better, because on first glance, you're thinking about, well, it looks like the knight is well placed, pawn is weak. If you go knight e5 to guard the pawn, now suddenly black can go rook d to e8. Suddenly you no longer have control of the e file, and it doesn't feel like it's all that great. But of course, for the computer, it doesn't care about the psychological aspects of like losing the open file or things like that. The computer just simply plays the absolute best move, and so it doesn't care. It simply thinks that after queen d2 here, even though now you've conceded the e file, you can plant the knight on e5. So let's just say black plays king b8 and you get d4. You now have a great bash with the knight on e5. Bishop is terrible on h7 behind the pawn wall, and because of these two trumps in the position, white is much better here. But for Magnus, and I think in general for us humans, when we look at a position like this, if you go back a few moves to something like this, we're thinking to ourselves, okay, we control the open e file. That is the one big advantage in the position for white, is the control of the e file. That combined with a bad bishop, those two things make the position great. So when you're thinking about this, especially in a rapid game more so than classical, when you reach a position like this, you're like, uh-oh, what's gone wrong? Suddenly I have a weak pawn on g4, bishop's not terrible on h7, and I'm losing control of the e file. The two big positional advantages that you have seem to be gone, but you can transform them after knight e5 once we get to this position here with d4, where you transform the advantages you had into different advantages. And that's one of the hardest things in chess for us humans to understand, especially at the top level, where you're so tunneled in on one idea and then suddenly the position shifts a little bit and you have to transform one of the advantages to another advantage, which would be this great bastion and the knight on e5. At any rate, Magnus plays bishop h3, and now Levon plays d4, and now it's time to become very concerned about your position, because your king is very weak suddenly. You don't have that dark square bishop. There's no fianchetto bishop. So for that reason, you're really in trouble. And now the knight has oxygen. It can go to d5 and c3, or d5 and b4. And now Magnus just completely loses the handle on the position here. He plays the move g5. I don't know if this was just panic or what happened. He obviously used about 4 minutes on this move. The only move that keeps the game going is this move queen to e5, but very hard to play this move because after rook f8, it feels like you're going to lose something here, like queen f4. Black can maybe even go c5 here. You just feel like knight d5 is incoming and you're getting killed. Now in this case it doesn't work, because after rook takes in g5 here, for example, if black plays knight to d5, you have f6 check, and it's the classic call the ambulance but not for me situation, where after king d8 you have queen d6 checkmate. But again, in a rapid game where you don't have a lot of time, you can't just sit there and use 20 minutes to think about one single move. It's very easy to lose control, and Magnus loses control. He plays g5, and now after pawn takes, knight takes, we get bishop to g8, and here we get the final blunder, which is bishop to g2. I guess not the actual final blunder, but it just starts to fall apart instantly. Magnus maybe here could have played a move, this very unusual move, queen to h2, but after rook to d5 with the idea of rook to a5, it simply looks like white is getting checkmated here, and it's just impossible to play. So we get bishop g2, which stops the rook lift, and now Levon plays this move rook to d5, and here Magnus just blunders by taking the rook, and after knight takes d5, he has nothing better to do than to resign the game. Now at this point, there still is queen to e7 here, forcing the trade of the queens, and white is still actually probably okay after takes, and rook to d7, and takes rook e1 or something like this. Again, white doesn't have any advantage, but white probably won't lose this endgame either. But I suspect that at this point Magnus just I don't know what happened. I wasn't watching this live, but I think he just finally felt like it was all falling apart, and he just blunders the game on the spot with taking. And after knight takes d5, you resign for the following reason. If you play c4 here, black does not have to play the glitch move, play n-peasant here, because if n-peasant is played after knight to e4, white is still in the game, but black does not have to play it. It is not a required move in chess, and so black can simply go knight c3 check, forking the king, the queen, and the rook, and this is what we know as the family fork. And if you play knight to e4 here, after knight to c3 check, if you go king to a1, queen takes a2 is checkmate. And if you trade the knights, now there's a simple checkmate with the classic Giambattista Lolli checkmate with queen b2. That is an actual term. It was invented by the famous Italian chess player nearly 500 years ago. So here white's just getting lolly mated on b2, and there's no way to stop it. You can go queen e8, takes, king d7, rook d8 takes, but next turn will be queen b2 no matter what you do. And that's why you have to be so careful when you play fianchettos and castle, because if you lose that fianchettoed bishop, a lot of threats can materialize seemingly out of thin air, like in this game where in a couple of moves it seemed fine, and next thing you know, it's all of a sudden losing for white. So Levon wins this game. Very difficult loss for Magnus in round number 8. He's still on a plus score because he won 2 games in a row. So he's won, I believe, 3 games, lost 2 games, and he has 3 draws. So he's 1 extra win, which is why I say +1, but very difficult for Magnus. So on that note, as promised, you guys, we are also going to be taking a brief look at the endgame from the other day between Viswanathan Anand and Magnus Carlsen. So I'm not going to go over the entire game. We're going to pick it up pretty late in the game here. So we reach this position. We're in an endgame here, and Magnus in this position after king e1 plays this move knight to c6. Now when you look at the position, just to give everybody a second to digest it, you'll notice that white has 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, black has 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. So even material, opposite color bishops. Now the first thing that you'll notice about this position is black has a classic wooden shield with the bishop on e4 here, which is much better placed than the bishop on b4. The bishop on b4 can't really target any of the black pawns easily. These pawns are all in the opposite color of the dark square bishop, and black's bishop targets both pawns on g2 and c2. Additionally, the only pawns, if white could possibly reach them, are the pawn on h6 via the f8 square. If somehow you could get bishop e7 and bishop h4, you could target the g3 pawn. But realistically, with both of these squares cut off, the white bishop on b4, the white dark square bishop, I should say, cannot go after the black pawns which are on the dark squares. So for that reason, black should be a little bit better here, also because the bishop can win the pawn on g2 and the g3 pawn can go down the board very quickly. So after knight c6, we get to move knight to e2. If you were to play knight takes c6 after rook takes d2, king takes d2, and bishop takes c6, this position might still be a draw, but you never really know here. And probably what Vishy thought about in this position, he thought that after king e3, bishop takes g2, if you try to sort of sit and wait here with like bishop b4, king e8, and you just keep waiting, he probably assumed that this endgame somehow was losing. Now I don't know if this endgame is losing or not. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. As I look at this position, my gut instinct says that probably it's losing, and the reason that I think it's probably losing is that eventually what's going to happen here is that probably black can bring the king in via d5, and you can't really prevent it. And at some point what's going to happen is that black will eventually play something like h4, takes, and after bishop d6, you have this move bishop to d1. You have to sort of wait with king h3, and now after king to e3, you can't really guard all the pawns here. If you go king g3, there's f4 check. If you play bishop c5 here, there's king d3, bishop b4, and now after f4, let's just say you go king g2, for example. After king to e2, bishop to c5, f3, king g3. Black can now play b4. If you take with the bishop, there's f2, f1, and if you take with a pawn, now after c3, you can't stop both of the pawns. The wide peepos do rule the day for black. So that's probably what Vishy saw, and so he goes for knight e2 instead. We get rook takes rook, king takes rook, bishop takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and now bishop to f3, king e3, bishop d1, king d2, bishop g4, king e3, and now king to e8. And this is effectively where the endgame starts. So once again, even material here, but black's bishop is better than the white bishop because the bishop on g4 targets these pawns on g4 and potentially c2. Bishop on b4 is kind of glued to the a5 pawn because otherwise you will lose it. If you ever move, you hang the pawn, and with it you hang the game. So the bishop is glued on b4, which is a big advantage for black. Additionally, knight is tied down to the pawn on h5, so that's already two big advantages for black here. Now in the game of chess, there's one general rule we have when it comes to the end games, which is that in end games, in order to win an end game, the common saying goes that one weakness is not enough to win the game. You need two weaknesses, and in this case there are effectively two weaknesses. You have the weak pawn on a5 with the bishop is stuck having to guard it, and you have the weak pawn on h5 and the knight is stuck guarding it. So in this case, the general theme or general maxim saying of two weaknesses, if there are two weaknesses, probably win. If there's one, it's not enough, should potentially hold true here. So after king e8, we get king to d2. Magnus plays knight to e7, and now we get the move bishop takes e7, which is a very, very committal move from Vishy Anand. Now again, this is a rapid game, so you cannot fault the players. They cannot think for 20 minutes obviously on any given move, but it's a very committal move here because in this position, when you trade the bishop for the knight, what you're basically saying here is that the knight can stay on g3 forever guarding the pawn, and black won't be able to break through on the queen side. Now in a perfect world, if we get a position like this, you'll notice that here black cannot enter with the king on either e4 or d4. However, black can go king c5 and b4 and go after the pawn on a5. So there is actually an entry point for the black king to win the pawn on a5 and then come back to the center and win the game. So in this position, after king takes e7 here, Vishy plays the move king c1, which loses the game on the spot. Now it's very hard to understand why king to e3 is actually a draw, but the reason is very, very deep and very counterintuitive, which is after king to d7, white can now play this very unnatural looking move knight to e2. Now as a human, your first thought is, well, black takes, the only idea here is to go knight d4, right? And after knight to d4, this probably is still a draw in this position, But Vichy probably thought, well, what's the big deal? Black can go king c6, and if knight d4, king d5, I'm going to lose the pawn on h5. He's going to push b4 eventually with king c5. I'm just going to lose the game. Why would I do that? And so if you can get the knight to d4, this is a drawn position because black has no entries. You'll notice that in this position, let me just set it up. You got some position like this. Black cannot get the king in. The d6 square is covered by the pawn. Knight covers the c6 square. King cannot go to b6. a5 covers that square. So all the entry squares for the king are covered, and this is just simply a dead draw. It is what we know as a fortress. Now, the thing is, after knight e2, what Magnus would have obviously played is not bishop takes h5, but this move king c6. And now if you go knight d4, king d5, as I said, this is losing, just to illustrate why. If you go king f2 after takes, king g3, black will be able to go b4. Your knight is no longer safe on d4, and with it you will lose the game. But after king c6, the reason this game is a draw is because the insane study-like move knight to c1. Now this move is not logical at all, and the only way you find this move is if you sort of understand the pawn structure, or you've seen a study with a similar position. If you've seen a study with a similar position, this move is very, very intuitive, and it's very probable that someone can find this move. But if you have never seen this move, this move or this idea, you'll never spot it, especially in a rapid game with a minute on the clock. Now the reason knight c1 draws the game is because now after black takes a pawn, you can go knight to a2. Let's just say black plays bishop to d1, and now after knight to b4, king b7, king f2, it's the exact same thing where the king will just sit in front of the pawn, but the white knight on b4 is now permanently glued to this b4 square, and now the king again has no entry squares. The b6 and d6 squares are covered by the pawns, and the knight covers the third square, so the king can never get in. And for that reason, again, it's a draw. It's just that from in this position, the knight is on b4 versus being on the more human square of d4. So going a2 and b4 is very, very counterintuitive, very, very difficult to find, and I'm not sure that even I would find that if it wasn't a classical game. In fact, I don't think I would unless I had seen a position like this. Now, the great thing for all the players who are studying chess every day and trying to improve, especially at the top levels, now that we've seen this sort of concept with a strange pawn structure, this idea of putting something on b4, d4 will be in our minds, and it's much more likely we'll be able to come up with it over the board based off of this game. So after takes, Vichy plays king c1 instead, and now after king to d7, none of these ideas with getting the knight to either b4 or d4 exist, and white is actually completely lost. We get king to b2, we get king c6, king a2, king d5, king a3, king to c5, and it's essentially what we call zugzwang in chess, where Magnus is zugzwanging the white king. He wants to be able to play b4. Now if it's black's turn here, there are other zugzwangs in the position, just like bishop to f3, for example, but the main point is that, let's just say white were to go knight f1, you cannot go b4 because you hang the pawn on b4. And so in this position, when Magnus goes king d5, king a3, king c5, he's basically saying to Vichy, you can't move the knight because you hang the pawn. When you move the king away to b2, now at some point I'm going to be able to play b4 and bring the king in. So we get king c1, bishop f3, king b2, and now we have b4 being played here by Magnus. Finally, trying to create some space, king can run over and gobble the pawn on a5, and black is probably much better. So we get pawn takes pawn, king to d4 being played here, which is an interesting choice, by the way. King takes b4 is playable here. Now the reason that Magnus did not play this move is that after c3, king takes e5, he probably thought that king to a3 could be a fortress here, and I'm not 100% sure if this is fortress. I don't think this is a fortress, and I'll tell you why. I don't think this is a fortress for a very counterintuitive reason. I think that after king b2, at some point down the road, you're going to be able to, I believe, walk the king all the way back, and I think you can sack. I thought you could maybe sack here. Oh, maybe it doesn't work. I thought maybe you could sack the bishop. If you can't sack the bishop, then maybe this is actually still a draw, because if you can't sack the bishop on h5 here, then white will permanently just be able to wait. And even in this position, the knight and the pawns cover the key entry squares on d4 and e4 here, so white probably is drawing again. I don't know if the eval bar is right or wrong. You can see that it says black is winning, but this too could be a fortress. So for that reason, Magnus goes king d4 here. We get c3, and now king to d3 is played here. Now the material is evened out here. You'll notice that both sides have, actually wait, material has not evened out. Magnus is down a pawn. White is up a pawn here, but black has a great bishop targeting the pawn on h5, and also white's king is stuck on b2 guarding the pawn on d3. So the active bishop, active king make it very difficult for white to play. Now Vichy plays b5, the only move here. If you move the knight and I take the pawn, this endgame is going to be losing quite easily, because the h pawn just rolls down the board quite quickly, and you have no counterplay. So you have to do something here, and Vichy does play b5, sacking the pawn back. We get pawn takes pawn, a6, we get king to d2, and now Vichy plays a7. Now in this position, knight to f1 is a better move, and the reason being that if king d3, you simply go back to g3, and if black tries to play a move like king to e2, knight g3, and let's just say king to e3, now after knight takes f5, white sacks the knight, and as the old saying goes, a bishop can't stop an avalanche. So after knight takes f5, pawn takes knight e6 here, the wide peepos rule the day, and the bishop cannot stop both of the pawns, and white will get a queen on either e8 or a8, and white is simply winning. So this would have been a draw. It's also worth noting that if black plays king takes f4, this is also losing, because now after knight takes h6, white once again has the wide peepos, black takes, and now after knight to f7, which is a very difficult move to find here, after bishop to f3 back to stop the pawn, now you can simply bring the king in, and the knight is simply guarding the pawn, so you just run the king up, push the pawn, and you win the game. Now again, all very dank, very difficult to understand. I'm not sure if Vishy did not see the idea necessarily, or if he just thought a7 was more forcing, more concrete, and he just went with it due to the low time situation. But knight to f1 would have drawn the game. Instead, we get to move a7 here, and now we get bishop to d5 being played by Magnus, and now again Vishy plays this move knight takes f5, sacking the knight. Now knight to f1 would draw once again, because after king e2, knight g3, if black plays king to d3 here, again you can sack the knight, because with the king on d3 here after e6, king b2, king d2, and e7 here, white is getting a queen on the next turn. Now as I said, hard to judge what Vishy saw. I suspect that at this point Vishy probably low on time, feeling some nerves, not sure, wanted to go for knight f5. He wasn't sure if it was okay or not okay, but he knew he was going to be able to get a pawn to the end of the board, and so he goes knight takes f5. Now this does effectively lose the game, because after pawn takes knight, we get e6, b4, and now with the king on d2 versus d3, there's a very slight and subtle nuance difference, which is the king will now escort the pawn to c1. The king on d2 covers the c1 square, whereas on d3, let me just illustrate the point. If you get to this position, for example, after e7, the king is not on d2, so if you take, I go king c1, and now I get a queen, whereas with the king on d2 here, after e7 takes, king e2, c2, black is getting a queen right away, and you also can't go to the c1 square. So it's a very slight, very subtle nuanced difference, but it makes a world of difference, and it's a difference between the game being potentially a white win and the game being a black win. So after b takes c3, we get king to a2. c2 is played here by Magnus. Vishy queens the a pawn. If you were to say queen the e pawn here, black can play c3, checking the king, and after king a3, black queens with check, and after king b4, many ways for black to win, but probably simply something like queen b2, king c5, and c2, getting a second queen on the board. Now one sample line could be king takes bishop here, and after black, I assume black should probably check, king to d6, black can probably, I don't know if queen wins on the spot, so maybe just queen a3 here, and after say king d5, just queen takes a7. You can't stop the pawn from queening, and it's a very simple win in the next couple of turns for Magnus. So instead we get a8 queen, bishop takes queen, white gets a queen, and now Magnus plays bishop to e4, which is a very interesting decision. And the reason it's a very interesting decision is because if black were to say queen here, for example, this is actually a forced draw. Now one thing that's very unclear is that after this game ended, Magnus made a tweet saying that he under promoted in this game because he couldn't find a queen. Now I don't know if that's actually true, or whether it was a joke, or whether it's being true, because in this position already, if you queen the pawn here, it's actually stalemate here. The pawns are fixed on the king side, so white can actually go queen e2, king c3, take. Actually, do you take the pawn? Probably not. Probably you just check here on d3. If you capture, it's stalemate. Same thing with pawn takes. And after king b4, queen d6, if you try to run away, I check, and I force you to take my queen, and it's GG, draw. Even though I'm down a lot of material, the king has no squares available. So you do have to be very careful. Now, what's also kind of insane about this endgame is that apparently c3 is the winning move here, and the reason c3 is winning is because now if white checks on, say, d8, you can go king to e2, and the two pawns, basically this pawn on c3 prevents white from being able to get over, and with these two pawns on c3 c2, you can't stop black from queening on the next turn. Say queen e7, bishop to e4 here, and if you go queen to a3, king d2, check, bishop d3, now I'm getting a queen. But more importantly, with the pawn on c3, now there are no ideas with stalemate. The king will always have this b3 square available, and black is completely winning. Now obviously not logical, not human at all, but it would have won on the spot. Instead we get bishop to e4, and now here we have queen to d8, bishop to d3, and now Vishy makes the blunder, the very obvious blunder, queen to d4, which loses the game. The drawing line here is the move queen to b6, and the reason that this draws is that now if black does not promote, I guess black can promote to a rook, and after queen to h6, probably it's still, maybe that's actually not a draw. I guess you have to go queen f2 and make some kind of repetition here. or get a checkmate in one with queen b2. But the main reason that queen b6 is winning here is that I suspect that Vichy probably forgot that after queen to d4, black can under promote the pawn. You do not have to promote a pawn to a queen. Now it's the strongest piece in the game of chess, but you do not have to promote it to a queen. So the reason that queen b6 would have drawn is that if black promotes to a queen, and we'll illustrate this in a second anyway, after queen to e3, this is stalemate. Once again, king has no squares. King goes to c2. Here you can play queen takes d3, and if you take, stalemate, take with a king, stalemate anyway, no squares available. But what Vichy probably forgot is that here if black tries to under promote to a knight, for example, after king to a1 and c3, the reason that this is still a draw is you have queen to e3 check, and now after king takes queen, it's stalemate once again. King has no squares available whatsoever. Now obviously very dank, very difficult to understand, but in this position, if black doesn't play c3, let's just say black plays a move like bishop e4, now you can take the pawn, because after c3, queen back to b6, let's just say knight d3, now you can go queen a5, pinning the pawn, and you also have this h pawn running up the board, and you're going to get a second queen here on the h file if black doesn't try to bail out. In fact, maybe black already can't bail out and it's already losing, but that's what would happen. Instead, Vichy plays queen d4, because probably Vichy's thinking here, well, after queen d4, okay, black queens, I go queen e3, it's going to be stalemate, as we just showed in the other variations. It's all hunky-dory. But after queen d4, black can now under promote to a knight, and it's actually losing on the spot here, because now if you go king to a1, there's knight to b3, forking the king and the queen. If you go to b2, I have knight to e2, knight attacks the queen, king and the bishop are guarding each other, everything is shielded here, and black simply escorts the pawn all the way up the board, and everything is nicely guarding each other. Bishop guards the pawn, knight guards the queening square, and after queen b4, king d1, you just lose the game immediately. So here the game is effectively over. Vichy plays king a3, Magnus goes c3 here, because now if you check on f2, again, I shield the king with the knight, and I'm just going to go c2 c1 next move, and you lose immediately. So Vichy tries to go queen b6, but now after knight to e2, we get queen takes h6, c2, queen to b. I don't know if queen b6 was actually played, by the way. I suspect it wasn't played. But we have queen to b6 being played here, and I don't think that's what happened. I think the game ended with queen c6, queen takes. Actually, no, something like takes h6 and knight f4, something like this. I don't believe queen b6 was played. Now I didn't look at the actual relay, but something like this happened where basically I think probably the game ended with queen c6, queen takes, and here Vichy resigns. If you go h6 trying to get a queen, black is just in time with knight takes f4, h7, and knight g6. Knight stops the pawn, you can push your own pawn down the board, and it's GG, why not? So this was an absolutely fascinating endgame, many very deep concepts. I really wish that this had been played in a classical game where we could have seen that the players would have found all these great ideas versus a rapid game, which turned into more or less blitz and bullet game at the end, because it was such a rich endgame, so study-like, so many different options for both sides, and it was really fascinating. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the Magnus game against Levon today, as well as my extra bonus bit of covering this endgame between Vichy and Magnus. At any rate, hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't. I'll be back very soon with some more great YouTube only content. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and see you soon. Bye.